An aging farmer, a dying crop, and a quiet order from city officials that changed everything. What began as a small-town dispute over water rights quickly spiraled into something far bigger, a test of loyalty, legacy, and the price of standing alone. No one expected what happened next. The day after his irrigation was cut off, the roar of helicopter blades shattered the Texas sky. A Marine Corps general stepped out, not for war, but to repay a debt buried deep in the sands of Afghanistan nearly 40 years ago. This isn't just a story about corn or politics. It's about honor, resilience, and a promise that time couldn't break. It all began the moment the water valve turned. Henry Cole was 68 years old, though some days the weight of the world made him feel older. He lived alone on a quiet stretch of land at the edge of Millfield, Texas, a town changing faster than the seasons. His small, weathered farmhouse sat under the wide, endless sky, flanked by 40 acres of corn and watermelon he had nurtured into existence year after year. Time had pressed deep grooves into his hands, each line telling part of a life divided in two. 15 years as a U.S. Marine, then 3 decades as a farmer. 2 uniforms, 2 battlegrounds. He had been discharged from the Corps in 1985, and not long after, he and Martha had found their way to this patch of stubborn Texas soil. Together they learned its rhythms, coaxed it to give, and respected it when it wouldn't. She had passed 5 years ago. Cancer, swift and merciless. Since then, the land has become everything to Henry, a sanctuary, a burden, a reason to get up every morning. Unlike the massive agribusiness operations that sprawled across the region, Henry's farm remained fiercely independent and painfully human. No drones, no chemicals that made bugs vanish overnight, just sweat, patience, and the occasional help of a local teenager looking to earn a few dollars during harvest season. His crops didn't just feed people. They fed a promise that good food could still come from good earth. He didn't cut corners, never had. The town knew him, even if it no longer understood him. He was the man who always arrived 15 minutes early, who paid his debts before they were due, and never once asked for an extension. You could set your watch by Henry Cole. And in a world full of shifting values and plastic words, that mattered. His neighbors respected him, even if they didn't always speak it out loud. But the land was changing, not just the soil, but the people and the priorities. Factories were moving in, bringing with them new zoning laws, industrial incentives, and a city council that barely resembled the one Henry had once stood shoulder to shoulder with at local events. The language of growth had replaced the language of roots. And then, on a warm September afternoon, with harvest just days away and the sun burning steady overhead, everything began to unravel. Henry had been inspecting his irrigation lines when the white SUV pulled up just past the property gate. A young man in mirrored sunglasses stepped out, clipboard in hand, every inch of him exuding the weightless confidence of someone used to quoting policies but not living the consequences. "Mr. Cole," the official said without introduction, "I have orders to shut off your irrigation access." Henry stood slowly, brushing soil from his knees, his back straightened, that old military posture never fully leaving him. "I've paid my water rights 30 years running," he said. "My harvest is this week." "The new zoning ordinance prioritizes industrial development," the official replied, not meeting his eyes. "The Suntech facility needs that water." "Progress, sir." Progress, that word again, the kind that didn't care how much sweat went into a single ear of corn. Henry watched as the young man walked over to the irrigation valve. When the metal wheel groaned to a close, the sound echoed like thunder across the silent fields. Just like that, the lifeblood of his crops was gone. No warning, no compromise. The official walked back towards his SUV, waving vaguely over his shoulder. "File an appeal with the board. They meet next month." Henry didn't move. He just stood there, clutching the brim of his old canvas hat, his lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't asking for pity, and he sure wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for time. That evening, the silence on Henry's farm was heavier than usual, the kind of silence that settles not because there's peace, but because something vital has gone missing. The rows of corn stood tall, but they were already beginning to feel the thirst. Henry walked slowly through them, trailing his fingers across the leaves as if trying to reassure them, or maybe himself. The sun had dipped behind the hills, casting the fields in gold, but instead of beauty, all he saw was a ticking clock. By nightfall, The news had already spread, not through official statements, but through smartphones and whispers. A grainy video taken from a distance showed Henry standing at the valve, motionless as it shut. The caption read, "Old-timer refuses to change with the times." Comments piled in like sand in an hourglass. Some mocked, some shrugged. Most were silent. And silence, Henry knew, could feel worse than mockery. He sat on his porch, nursing a mug of black coffee, long gone cold, staring out at the horizon. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel like his. It felt like it had been taken. And only one person came that night. Sarah Jenkins, the seed store owner, pulled up in her dusty pickup. The engine cut out, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. In the bed of her truck were 3 plastic containers of water. "It's not much," she said, placing them beside his porch steps. "Might be enough for a few rows." Henry looked up, eyes glassy but unbroken. He nodded, tipping his hat in silent thanks. Words were too small to hold what he felt. As Sarah drove off, he ran his hand over the rough handles of the water jugs. Then he looked out to the fields and began the impossible math. Hundreds of stalks, each needing life. Maybe 50 could be saved, maybe less. At 5 a.m., Henry was already in the fields. He'd been up all night, rigging a network of tubes and buckets from his personal well. The water was brackish, not meant for crops, but it was all he had. Hour after hour, he moved down each row, giving just enough to keep the plants from folding entirely under the rising sun. By noon, his shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands raw and bleeding. The pain didn't matter. The heat didn't matter. What mattered were those stalks, those lives under his care. A Marine never leaves his men behind, he told himself. These plants, they depended on him now. That night, Henry wrote in the worn journal Martha had given him years ago, the same one where he recorded planting dates, soil conditions, and yield notes. This entry was different. "If the corn's still standing tomorrow, I'll make it to the end. I swore to protect something. This is what's left. This is what I protect." But by day 3, even willpower began to buckle. His hands trembled as he adjusted the cracked tubing of his makeshift system. His water reserves were low, dangerously so. The Texas sun punished the land with no sign of mercy. That afternoon, 14-year-old Miguel Vasquez, who sometimes helped out around the farm, biked down the dusty road, backpack still slung over his shoulder. He found Henry slumped beside a leaking pipe, shirtless, his skin darkened from the sun and streaked with dirt. The boy rushed to help. "You need to rest, Mr. Henry," Miguel urged. "You're going to make yourself sick." Henry didn't respond right away. He was staring into the dust, sweat dripping into his eyes. Miguel's gaze drifted to a faded tattoo on Henry's upper arm, the globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Beneath it, etched in faded ink, were the years 1970, 1985. Miguel had never seen it before. Henry always wore long sleeves, even in the heat. Later, while cleaning tools, Miguel spotted a photo buried in the shadows of the old workbench. In it, a younger Henry stood among a small group of Marines, rifles slung, fatigue in their eyes, a mountain range behind them. The frame was dusty, the kind of dust that tells you no one's looked at something for a very long time. Kandahar Province, 1983, scribbled in fading ink on the back. "You were in Afghanistan?" Miguel asked, his voice filled with quiet awe. Henry paused, then nodded. "Long before it was on the news every night." "Did you fight?" the boy whispered. Henry's eyes dimmed with memory. "I helped someone come home," he said softly. That was all. By the 4th day, the fight had gone from difficult to brutal. The few surviving rows of corn drank greedily from what little water Henry could spare, but the rest of the field had begun to surrender. Once strong stalks curled inward, the leaves dry and brittle like hands folded in prayer, with no one left to answer. Henry's patched-together irrigation system, garden hoses, cracked plastic barrels, salvaged tubing, was barely holding. He spent hours chasing leaks, patching splits, repositioning barrels to catch whatever condensation the night might offer. His body was failing him. Every movement sent sharp aches down his spine. His knees throbbed. His fingers, once firm and precise, had grown clumsy from swelling. That afternoon, as temperatures climbed past 103 degrees, he found himself staring blankly at a split hose, his hand gripping duct tape but unable to move. He heard Miguel's voice before he saw him. "Mr. Henry!" the boy shouted, running across the field. He dropped to his knees beside him, sweat already forming on his brow. "You have to stop. You're burning up." Henry didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. His vision swam. He heard a high-pitched ring in his ears. Miguel helped him to his feet, walking him toward the shade of the barn. Inside, Henry slumped against the wall. Dust floated in the narrow beams of sunlight, and the still air smelt like wood, earth, and exhaustion. "I found this the other day," Miguel said, handing Henry the old framed photograph. The boy's voice trembled. "Was this you?" Henry took it without a word, brushing a thick layer of dust from the glass. The image had faded over the years, but he still remembered that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who'd stared down hell and come out breathing. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was us." Miguel studied the photo. "The one you helped come home? Was he in this picture?" Henry pointed to the man on the far right, barely more than a kid then, face smudged with ash, helmet crooked, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Robert Stone," Henry said. "Lieutenant back then. We were ambushed outside the village. He took shrapnel to the leg, couldn't walk. Carried him 2 miles through enemy fire to the medevac point." Miguel looked at Henry differently now, not just as a farmer, but as something more, something permanent. "Why'd you never tell anyone?" Henry exhaled, long and quiet. "Wasn't the kind of thing you brag about. You just do it. Then you go home." But going home hadn't made things easier. Later that evening, as the sun bled across the fields, Henry found an envelope propped against his door. The delivery truck that left it was already gone by the time he stepped outside. Inside the plain brown package was a single sheet of aged yellow paper. At first glance, it looked like a letter from another time. The handwriting was steady, firm, and unmistakably military. "Sergeant Henry, I still owe you one. R. Stone, USM." Beneath the signature was a Washington, D.C. phone number. Henry stared at it for a long time, the sounds of the evening, cicadas, wind in the trees, fading behind the weight of memory. He hadn't seen or heard from Stone in nearly 40 years. The last time they spoke had been in a muddy tent under heavy gunfire. Henry had carried him on his back like a brother. He folded the note carefully, as if it might crumble under rough hands, and placed it in his wallet beside an old photo of Martha. He didn't call the number. The next morning, the sun returned with vengeance. Heat shimmered above the cracked earth. By midday, the last of Henry's reserve water had run dry. His well was almost bone dry too, just a trickle when he turned the spigot. Still, he kept working. Neighbors passed on the road, glancing at him with unease. One even slowed down enough to call out, "Give it up, Henry. You're fighting City Hall and the weather. Can't beat both." Henry didn't look up. He simply nodded once and kept walking. He didn't hold it against them. They were scared. People always were when standing too close to someone who refused to quit. Later that day, Sarah returned with more water. This time, she didn't come alone. She had made some calls. 3 local teenagers, friends of Miguel's, arrived in a rusty pickup with jugs and old canisters. It wasn't enough to save the crop, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough to keep Henry from killing himself trying. That night, Henry collapsed into his porch chair, skin blistered from the sun, his body a map of aches and cuts. The corn whispered in the wind, weak and brittle. He still hadn't called the number. He didn't file an appeal. He didn't go to the water board. He simply returned to the fields the next morning, as if he believed that somewhere between muscle and memory, he could still bend the land back into hope. By the 5th day, the fight was no longer about crops. It was about dignity. The land had hardened. Every step across the field kicked up dust that hung in the air like a memory. The corn was dying fast. Brown stalks bowed to the sun, their edges curled and brittle. Each one looked like a fallen soldier on a battlefield Henry knew all too well. That morning, Sarah passed by again, this time with growing worry etched into her face. She found Henry on his knees trying to realign a warped section of tubing. His movements were slow, jerky, like a wind-up clock winding down. "Henry, you have to stop, please," she begged, dropping beside him. He looked up at her with glassy eyes, lips cracked from dehydration. "Just a few more rows," he whispered. She could see it then. He wasn't just trying to save corn. He was holding on to the last thing in his life that still responded to care. By noon, the heat had become unbearable. 104 degrees, no clouds, no wind. The field shimmered like a mirage. Miguel returned, this time with more water and a terrified look in his eyes. He'd never seen Henry this weak. An hour later, Henry collapsed between two rows of corn. Sarah slammed her brakes when she saw his motionless body sprawled under the sun. She sprinted across the field, dialing 998 as she went. His skin was scorching to the touch. His breath was shallow. "You hear me, Henry?" she cried. "Don't you dare give up on me." At the clinic, the doctor confirmed what Sarah feared. Severe heat stroke, dangerous dehydration, pushed past the brink. "You're not 20 anymore, Henry," the doctor said, shaking his head. When Henry woke, pale and tethered to IV lines, his first words were, "How's the field?" "The field isn't your problem anymore," the doctor muttered, but Henry didn't hear. His mind had already drifted back to the rows, the soil, the promise he'd made, the one that had nothing to do with ordinances or crop yields. And against medical advice, Henry discharged himself the next morning and went straight home. What greeted him there was worse than he'd imagined. Nearly half the crop was gone, blackened, hollow. A whole season of effort slipped through his fingers like loose dirt. He stood at the edge of the rows, clutching his hat in both hands. The wind moved gently, but not enough to shake the silence. Then a sound, faint, rhythmic, growing louder, broke through the stillness. Womp, womp. It wasn't traffic. It wasn't a crop duster. Henry knew that sound. The CH-53 Super Stallion helicopter roared over the horizon like a steel ghost from another lifetime. Its massive rotors churned the air, kicking up dust in all directions as it descended directly onto Henry's property. The neighbors came out of their houses, shielding their eyes, phones raised, mouths agape. This wasn't a rescue chopper or a storm watch aircraft. This was military, unmistakably. The helicopter touched down at the edge of the cornfield, flattening what remained of the weakened stalks. The side door slid open. A tall man stepped out. Dress uniform, silver hair, 3 stars gleamed on each shoulder. General Robert Stone. Even after 4 decades, Henry recognized him instantly. Stone scanned the field, squinting against the wind. Then he shouted over the roar, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Where is Sergeant Henry?" Henry stood frozen, hands still gripping his hat, as memories collided with reality. For a split second, his spine straightened into perfect military posture before he caught himself. Stone spotted him. "There you are," the general said, striding across the field. He extended his hand. "It's been a long time, Sergeant." Henry took the hand, his grip firm despite the pain. "Not a sergeant anymore, sir, just a farmer now." Stone smiled. "Once a Marine, always a Marine." "Didn't send a message, sir," Henry said quietly, his brow furrowed. Stone reached into his coat and pulled out the yellowed note, the one Henry had received days earlier. "You didn't call the number?" "No, sir." Stone's face shifted, not confused, but resolute. "Then someone else did. Said Henry Cole was fighting his last battle, and this time he was losing." Henry followed Stone's gaze to the edge of the crowd, where Sarah stood with Miguel by her side. She didn't flinch when their eyes met. She had made the call. Local news crews began to arrive, alerted by the low-flying helicopter and curious phone calls from neighbors. Reporters spilled into the fields with microphones and cameras. Stone, realizing the cameras were now trained on him, squared his shoulders and turned to the crowd. "My name's General Robert Stone, Commander of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. I'm here today because 38 years ago this man carried me through hell." He pointed to Henry. "In Kandahar, 1983, our unit was ambushed. I had shrapnel in my leg, couldn't walk. Sergeant Henry Cole could have left me, should have, by protocol. Instead, he threw me over his back and carried me 2 miles under enemy fire." The crowd was silent. "He saved my life, and now I find him here, fighting a different kind of battle over a water valve." The crowd held its collective breath as General Stone's voice rang out across the dying field. "I've made some calls on my flight here," he continued, his tone now harder, sharper. "Do you know what Suntech, the company this water was diverted to, actually does?" He turned his piercing gaze toward the stunned city officials standing awkwardly near the reporters. "They're a defense contractor. They work for me." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Cell phones recorded, cameras zoomed in. "I wonder how they'll feel knowing they're being prioritized over a veteran who once risked his life to protect their very existence. Over this man, this farmer, this Marine, who carried me through bullets so I could serve another day." The director of Municipal Water Utilities stepped forward, clipboard in hand, face flushed. "General, sir, the new ordinance was passed unanimously." It's I don't give a damn about your ordnance, Stone cut in, voice like steel. I care about how you treat American heroes. I want that water turned back on now, and I want a full review of how these decisions are being made, who benefits and who pays. The official's words caught in his throat. Yes, General, immediately. Within the hour, city workers returned, accompanied by sheriff deputies and media drones buzzing overhead. With shaking hands, they reopened the irrigation valve at the edge of Henry's land. A loud metallic groan echoed across the field as water finally surged through the long, dry pipes. The crowd, once silent, broke into spontaneous applause. Henry didn't speak. He just stood there, hands resting lightly on his knees, watching as life-giving water rushed through his system. The sound, that humble rush, was the most beautiful music he'd heard in weeks. General Stone remained beside him, saying nothing. There was no need. The gesture had already spoken volumes. I didn't expect all this, Henry finally said, his voice a rasp from sun and silence. I didn't either, Stone replied. I was just coming to check on an old friend, pull a few strings if I could. But when I saw the state of your fields, and how they left you out here, alone... He didn't finish a sentence. The wind carried the rest. That evening the story exploded across the nation. The image of a decorated Marine general landing in a farmer's dying field became a symbol of something greater, of veterans forgotten, of dignity nearly erased, of what happens when policies forget people. Donations poured in online. Messages from across the country flooded local social media. People sent money, equipment, and supplies. Some sent only words, but those meant the most. You reminded us what honor looks like, one message read. Another, my grandfather was a farmer and a Marine. Thank you for standing up for both. Teenagers organized to help salvage what they could of the harvest. Veterans from 3 counties showed up with gloves and buckets and quiet resolve. They didn't need recognition. They saw in Henry a reflection of their own unfinished battles. Reporters camped near the road, but Henry gave no interviews. When asked why, he answered simply, I just want to grow corn. That kind of quiet resistance said more than any soundbite could. The city council, reeling from national backlash, met in an emergency session. Under public pressure, they voted unanimously to amend the ordinance. A special clause was added. Any veteran running an agricultural operation would be exempt from future water restrictions. The mayor himself drove to Henry's farm and handed him the papers in front of news crews. Henry accepted them with a nod, then folded them neatly into his back pocket. No smile, no gloating. General Stone remained for another day. He declined all media interviews, telling reporters, this isn't about me. This is about doing right by the men who gave everything and asked for nothing. Before he left, Stone stood once more with Henry at the edge of the field as the sun dipped behind the horizon. You never called me Henry, he said gently. Why? Henry looked out at the newly damp earth. Never been one to ask for help, sir, even when I needed it. Especially then, Stone replied softly. They stood in silence for a moment, watching teenagers moving carefully through rows of corn, now glistening under the returning flow of water. You know, Stone said, some people think farming and soldiering are nothing alike, but they're wrong. Both demand sacrifice, both ask you to believe in something that might not pay off, both are about service. Henry nodded, and both leave scars. They didn't shake hands this time, they just stood side by side, letting the weight of memory and survival bind them without words. As the cameras zoomed in from the road, the final frame captured Henry, hat in hand, sweat-stained shirt fluttering gently, watching his field drink once more from the earth. His eyes glistened, not from the wind, but from something deeper. Relief, gratitude, maybe grace. Justice hadn't come quickly, but it had come. In the weeks that followed, Henry's farm began to change. Not in the way corporations renovate or modernize. This was a quieter transformation. Organic, human. The damaged crops had not all survived, but enough did. Enough to remind Henry that all was not lost. That the land, like people, could recover, if given the chance. Volunteers showed up daily. Veterans with broad shoulders and quiet eyes, teenagers with dirt under their nails. Sarah came by every evening with a thermos of sweet tea and the latest town gossip. Even neighbors who had once stayed silent now dropped off casseroles, spare tools, or simply pulled up a chair on Henry's porch. There was no parade, no ceremony, just shared labor, shared silence, and shared meals. Henry, still recovering from heat stroke, moved slowly at first, but each day his posture returned and his stride steadied. He began speaking again. Not much, just enough to pass on what he knew: how to read the clouds, when to check for root rot, how to trust the timing of the soil even when the world above it seemed chaotic. He started donating his best seed corn to young families starting small farms in surrounding counties. No charge. The land needs memory, he told one young couple. The best way to keep it alive is to share it. And he meant it. News cameras eventually left, the online attention faded, but Henry's impact remained. General Stone kept in touch, visiting again in the fall when the corn stood tall and golden. They walked the fields together, old warriors in a new kind of uniform, flannel and denim, but carrying the same sense of duty. Some plant for profit, Henry said, running his callous fingers along a stalk, but some plant because, if they don't, the land forgets what it's for. Stone nodded. And some people fight not because they want to win, but because they refuse to let others lose. That fall, the town of Millfield dedicated a new sign at the edge of Henry's property. Painted by local artists, it read, "Here stood a man who never asked but always gave." They hung it near the barn beside a mural that depicted the Super Stallion helicopter landing in the field. A moment so surreal, it could have been a legend if not for the cell phone footage. The city council, under continued public scrutiny, passed a second motion. Henry's farm would be designated a veteran historical site protected from future rezoning. No more threats, no more valves at the mercy of development. The official document was delivered personally by the mayor, who showed up with a fresh press suit and a false smile. Henry accepted the papers with the same calm dignity he carried into battle and harvests alike. He didn't ask for it. He hadn't even wanted it. But the town needed the gesture more than he did. And something else had changed. Where once there had been a distance between Henry and the town, a respectful gap, now there was warmth. Not loud, not flashy, but present. Kids started calling him Mr. H. A few of them even stopped by after school just to hear stories, not about war, not about the helicopter, just about life. Miguel became a regular. He helped with the harvest, learned to repair hoses, and even started sketching ideas for a small garden of his own. Henry gave him the back corner of the field. "Every man deserves his row to plant," he said. And perhaps most quietly of all, Sarah's late-night visits to drop off water turned into morning coffee on the porch. They didn't talk much at first, but over time their silences grew companionable. Shared roots, shared scars. One crisp October morning, as the mist burned off the fields and golden lights spilled across the rows, Henry stood at the edge of the corn. He had no script, no speech, just the moment. He looked out across what had been nearly lost and then found again, not through policy, not through power, but through people. Through principle, through stubborn, unshakable belief that when you do right, the land remembers. The camera crews didn't return, the headlines faded, but every stalk of corn that season stood a little tall, because it had been fought for. Because someone stood when others walked away, and because, in a world that often moves too fast to notice, one man's stillness had reminded everyone what honor looks like.